You don't need a weapon in your hand to be a threat to someone's life. You don't need a weapon in your hand to be a threat to someone's life, especially if your BAC is a .285, you have Xanax in your system, and you're charging downhill at somebody, especially if you're tackling someone on hard pavement, trying to get their gun. Stephen waited until the last moment before he pulled the trigger on the shots that hit Mr. Brough. You heard from the medical examiner that Mr. Brough was within 2 feet. You know from the measurements that they took at the scene that that hill was 11 feet in length and a 2 feet elevation. Mr. Brough was charging downhill at Stephen, and he got within 2 feet before Stephen pulled the trigger. He waited until the last moment. He did not have any choice at that point. That's where he's defending himself. It's not the 90 feet he walks from his car. We'll get to that in a moment. He's defending himself from a lethal threat because he's got someone charging downhill at him, actually 2 people. And if he doesn't pull that trigger, they are going to tackle him and take that gun. And you know that because even after he demonstrated that he would use lethal force to protect himself, they still tackled him to try and get that gun. That's how brazen these guys were. Now, they put him in a headlock, they're punching him, they're trying to get that gun from him. And that's why he pulled it out the second time. Now, he didn't have full control when he's doing that because one arm's being grabbed, he's in a headlock, they're punching him, kicking him. So he didn't have full control over where those shots went, but he waited until the last moment then too. He knew that if he waited any longer, they were going to subdue him and take that gun. And if they did that, they would shoot him. Well, maybe they wouldn't, but would you bet your life on it, given what we've seen with that scene? Those were life-threatening actions. Stephen had a right to defend himself from those attacks. You know, we've heard from a lot of people. It wasn't 50 to 60, though. Check my count here. We had 37 witnesses, including Stephen. It's not 50 or 60. And they weren't all in agreement with each other. Okay? Everyone was all over the place. Unfortunately, your job is to try and piece together exactly what happened based on everyone's perceptions of what they told you happened. Some of which we know were people just not telling the truth. Some of it is just the shock and the adrenaline of what's going on. Perceptions of what happened clearly weren't accurate, and that's on both sides. But I'll go through piece by piece, and you'll see where there are consistencies. But the Delta Chi's clearly not being honest with you. No. I mean, it starts from the beginning. They said it was just a gathering. There's a couple of them that admitted a party. But they said this is just a casual, usual Thursday night. If what happened that night was their example of a casual Thursday night, Flagstaff should go on lockdown when they decide to have a party. This was not a casual Thursday night. And if it was their usual Thursday night, it just shows you how aggressive these guys are. They were wasted and up to no good when they encountered these 3 freshmen on Franklin. We heard from Peering that when the moment came that he was running into the Mountain View parking lot, it was just Colin and 3 guys. Of course, that's not what he told the police, and we know that's not the truth. Every other witness described many more guys out there, but Peering wants you to believe that he just came running out there to help his friend and then got shot for it. But we know that's not what happened. We know that he was out there from the start. And he took this stand and he lied to you and said that he just came running out at the last moment when Colin got shot. What he told the police that night, when things were fresh in his mind about what happened, and he didn't have a year and a half to think about things, was that he was running up to calm Brough down. And that at that moment, as he's running up, he jumps the bush, and that's when he got shot. Tries to tell you that he ran after the shots. But he told the police he ran and jumped that bush as he was getting shot. And that was before Brough was shot. He was running up to calm Brough down. That's what he told the police. He also told the police that he remembers these three kids as they were backing up saying, "We're leaving." They weren't being the aggressors here. That's clear. Nick Prado, he lied to you when he tried to claim that he wasn't out there from the beginning. We know from some of his other brothers that he was out there. He wants to say that he was hanging back and then didn't start running up until after the shots. But we know that's not true. If he was hanging back where he said he was in the street when the shots came out, then his girlfriend, who was looking for him, would have been able to easily find him. She couldn't find him because he was much further down into the Mountain View parking lot. He was part of the original fray. That's why she couldn't find him. Of course, there's Mullen, who not only lied to you about what he did that night, he lied to the FBI. He's still trying to claim that he wasn't out there on Franklin, or he wasn't in the Mountain View parking lot, despite Nick Acevedo very clearly saying that he came running right after the shots back towards the courtyard and told him to call 911. Why do the Delta Chi's bother with these lies anyway? I mean, if Stephen is in the wrong, why are they lying about whether they're there, how far back they are? Why does it even matter? It's guilty conscience. That's why it matters. It's the same reason that Oscar Contreras went and hired a lawyer the next morning. They don't want to place themselves being out there because they know that what they were doing was wrong. They created this environment. They created this chaotic scene by attacking these three young freshmen. No, if these guys were the Boy Scouts that the state wants you to think they were, then why did they chase them after Contreras punched Stephen? If Brough is the peace-loving guy that they've tried to claim, then why didn't he say, "Whoa, Austin, what are you doing, man? Leave these kids alone. Hey, sorry, man, this guy's out of line. Let me get your glasses for you." Did they do that? No. This mob chases them. They weren't done. They made that clear by chasing them, pushing them to the ground, throwing punches. The prosecutor says there was only one punch thrown. We have heard from numerous witnesses that other punches were thrown. Nick Acevedo said he saw Prado throw a punch. That wasn't on the sidewalk. I mean, that wasn't out in the Franklin Street. That was on the sidewalk. They weren't done attacking these kids. Even worse, though, than the Delta Chi's not being honest with you is the state. It's the state's duty to seek justice and go follow the truth. And they didn't do that here. They have tried to paint the picture in one particular direction. And, of course, that's what lawyers do. But they have gone too far by hiding witnesses. Why didn't they call Mullen? They knew last year that he lied to the FBI. They knew he was out there because all of his brothers were putting him out there. But they just ignored that. They could have called him. They could have had him explain himself. He had no good explanation, so they just tried to wipe it under the rug. Same thing with Amanda Conrad. She was a friend of all of theirs, but we had to call her because they didn't want you to hear that she clearly saw Stephen pointing in the air with his gun. They want you to think that he was aiming on those second round of shots. But there's plenty of evidence to show that's just not the case. And they hide witnesses that contradict their theory of the case. There's another thing they didn't really quite level with you about. If we could pull up Exhibit 317. Just push this button. This is the scene. You're going to have this. This is the one that has all the photos attached to it. So you can see this scene. This shows you where they tackled Stephen. You can see those trees in the background. I'll talk about those trees a little bit more. All the casings and evidence that they took, the blood spots that they took. And you'll see right there, SC number 21, blood of Zintek. There's also SC 19, blood of Kyle Zintek. Now, this is their evidence. They introduced it. But you'll notice they haven't ever really pointed out to you that Kyle Zintek was shot over here. And yet if we pan, can I pan with this? Or which way? Pan towards courtyard, please. That's good. We pan, we see that is the corner where he fell, over by those boulders. When you saw that, they demonstrated the photos there too. So you can see Zintek was shot in that corner and ran. Why haven't they really brought that up? I mean, they're not necessarily hiding it. It is their evidence, but they certainly haven't emphasized it at all for you. Didn't talk about it once this morning. Why is that? Because Zintek testified that he only went a couple steps and then he fell. And the evidence clearly contradicts that. Now, it could just be his perception, that he thinks he's going 2 feet, but with the adrenaline, he went clearly much further than that. That's fine. It doesn't mean Zintek's lying. But it is important because they want you to think that he was shot in the back as he's running away. The reality is he was right there surrounding Stephen with all the other guys. He was part of the scrum. And he told the police that he was going towards Stephen to take the gun. That's why Stephen couldn't wait any longer, because not only did he have one guy in a headlock, another guy grabbing his arm, some guys punching and kicking him, but he had more guys coming. He knew there were more guys coming. Zintek was one of those guys. And unfortunately for Zintek, he got hit by bullets when Stephen finally got his gun free and started to try and shoot up in the air. When he started firing those shots, he's on the ground. And he's lifting. If we can pan back to that corner, please. He's on the ground there in that first parking spot, the one that doesn't have the lines in it. They collected a lot of blood from that scene, by the way. They didn't have any of that analyzed. Would have shown you that that's where Stephen was tackled. I mean, you might remember from the opening in this case, they didn't mention anything to you about tackling. They said he was punched once way over in the street, and that was the only physical altercation ever. You now know that's not true. But when he was tackled there, you recall he had kneeled over to give first aid. He had holstered the gun. At that point, he's not a threat to anyone. He's holstered the gun. There have been plenty of people at that point yelling at him, running up to him. Pletke and Volpa ran up to him. He pointed the gun at Jacob. He pointed the gun at plenty of people and did not fire because they weren't a threat. He was able to assess that and realize they're not a threat. Then he put the gun away, told Jacob to call 911, and started to give aid to Brough. And I can understand why the Delta Chi's wouldn't take kindly to Stephen trying to give aid. That's why they pushed him away. But he's facing Colin. He's facing Mountain View. He's pushed back and tackled there. And when he's finally able to break free and decides he needs to shoot in the air to get these guys to disperse, not shoot at particular people, but shoot in the air, he goes to put his arm back, and that's how he ends up hitting Kyle Zintek, who's behind him. Zintek saw it coming, and so he was able to turn. But this isn't a case where he was running and was way down the way when he got shot in the back. Stephen certainly didn't aim at him. Same thing with Nick Prado. Nick Prado is standing right over him there when he gets shot. He's not aiming at him as well. He can't aim because he's got guys tackling him. He's got a guy has him in a headlock. They're grabbing his arm. He doesn't have full control of the gun at that moment. Now, I want to switch over to our photos here. Now, you saw we brought this tree up with the detective. You'll note that's not in their links. They didn't include this tree because they don't want you to think about this tree. The importance of this tree is that that's right behind where Kyle Zintek is. This tree gets shot, and they could have analyzed that branch for you and confirmed that. But we know that tree got shot. There's no other debris anywhere around. And if we scroll through these photos, you can clearly see they put crime scene tape there. You can clearly see they're documenting this tree because that branch got shot. And that branch is in the same trajectory as where Kyle Zintek was shot. That's one of the other bullets that they haven't accounted for you. There's 2 more they haven't accounted for. If any of those bullets were in that scene, they would have found them. They couldn't find them because he shot in the air. Unfortunately, he's being tackled as he's trying to get away and shoot in the air. And that's how Kyle Zintek gets shot. That's how Prado gets shot. And that's how this tree got shot. You know, the prosecution has brought up the 90 feet over and over again. 90 feet is only the distance between home plate and first base. And it's a lot less distance than the distance these guys chased Stephen and his friends. You remember Detective Rucker told you the distance from the curb on Franklin to where all of this happened was over 200 feet. If we're going to talk about distances, these guys were chased for over 200 feet. At the point that Stephen ran to his car and got his gun, he wasn't thinking about shooting. The prosecutor said he was eager to shoot. If he was so eager to shoot, then why did he wait until the last second? He waited until he didn't have a choice anymore. He also didn't use all his bullets. If he was so eager to shoot, why did he just shoot the 2 guys charging at him and then put his gun away? There were plenty of other guys running up to him that were calling him psycho, getting in his face. He didn't shoot any of them because he recognized they weren't threats. They weren't running downhill at him. He wasn't eager to shoot. The state has mentioned, you don't bring a gun to a fist fight. This wasn't a fist fight. This wasn't a couple guys that decided to take it outside because they were having a beef about something. This was a mob attack. These guys were drunk, very drunk, and they attacked 3 freshmen for no good reason. Maybe because they knocked on their door. That's not a reason to come out and attack people. And these kids were backing up saying, we're leaving. And they kept attacking them. And even after one of them sucker punched Stephen, cracked him, as he said it, they still pursued them. They had, at that moment, if they were so peace-loving, they could have said, oh, whoa, we're sorry. This is getting out of hand. Just, we see you're leaving, good. They didn't do that. They chased them. They pursued them. It's unfortunate, but it was immediately necessary when Brough was charging down that hill for Stephen to shoot. And same thing for Nick Peering. If he didn't shoot at that point, they would have tackled him. And who knows what would have happened next. He doesn't have to wait and see what's going to happen next. And frankly, we know what would have happened next. Because even after he demonstrated that he would protect himself with lethal force, these guys still tackled him and tried to get his gun. Beginning in this case, the prosecutor told you that Stephen was an assassin on a rampage. Assassins don't use flashlights. Assassins don't announce that they have a gun and wait. Plenty of guys recognize that he had a gun. You've heard, we didn't hear anyone say that Bruce said he was going to kill. We didn't hear anyone say that Stephen said he had a gun. Well, some people did say they heard that. And many people, in fact, every witness said that they heard lots of yelling and screaming, and they couldn't really make out what was said. Okay? The state has to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove to you that those statements weren't made. And it's reasonable to infer that these statements were made because there's lots of statements being made and no one rules anything out. No one says, he definitely didn't say that because he definitely said this. Most of them said, I don't know what was being said. It was crazy out there. There was yelling and screaming and words on both sides, and I don't know what was said. Which means you can't conclude that he didn't say, I'm going to kill you, or that Stephen didn't say, I have a gun. You know, the prosecution told you, again, only one punch. You heard from all the girls looking out from Mountain View that there was punching, pushing, and charging. How many times did we hear about the guy in the white shirt charging? Now, it's true there's more than one white shirt. The prosecutor made a point of admitting Nick Acevedo's shirt because it was white. I don't know if that means they're trying to claim now that he was the one charging. Clearly, that's not the case. He had always said that he was hanging back. And like many of his friends, unlike them, I think he really meant that he was hanging back. But Prado had a white shirt, and Acevedo said he saw Prado throwing punches, and that he was in that area in the sidewalk. So maybe it was he that was charging. But we know from Mikey that the person that was shot was also wearing a white shirt and was charging right before he was shot. Mikey, who's not a friend of any of these guys, really one of the heroes of this case, who runs out there to give aid. And she said before she ran out there, she saw a guy in a white shirt charging right before he was shot. She was clear that that was the person that was shot. So the white shirt charging was Brough. There might have been other guys in white shirts running around, but the white shirt charging at the moment that Stephen had to shoot was Brough. You know, described Putke as a hero in this situation for trying to get the gun. Might be understandable that he's thinking he needs to do that, but the moment that he does that, Stephen has put the gun away. He's bending over to give first aid. He's yelling out to call 911. He's not a threat to anyone. And tackling him, unfortunately, made this tragic situation much worse. And, you know, Chase Jones had no trouble getting Stephen to just put his gun down. Walked right up to him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, man, it's all right. I'll watch your gun. I'll make sure this guy that's lurking over here isn't going to take it." And Stephen put it down. That's all it took. He didn't have to be tackled and put in a headlock. They didn't have to disarm him at that moment. He put the gun away. We've heard about Stephen's vision. I know 4 of you have glasses. I don't know how many of you are wearing contacts. I wear contacts. I know Mr. Barker doesn't have any vision problems himself. But those of you that wear glasses or have to use corrective vision, you know that when you don't have your glasses on or you don't have your contacts on, it doesn't make you blind immediately. When Stephen's saying that he could see his friends were surrounded over there, he said that it was blurry, but he could still tell. Not only that, he had just run from that area where they were being attacked, so he reasonably inferred that they were over there surrounded. And they were surrounded. They told you they were still being attacked by these guys. So he correctly used his limited vision to tell that. The fact that he could see there people over there just because he didn't have his glasses on doesn't mean that he wasn't telling the truth, because there were people over there. We all know that. Now, Stephen was consistent throughout his interrogation. Obviously, he had a misperception of how far he walked up to that group. He thought it was only 5 to 10, 15 feet, and we know that it was further than that. But he was consistent throughout that. He didn't waver. He didn't change his story with the police. They went over it with him 4 times. That was his perception. I mentioned that before, and I'll go over some other examples of perceptions that were just wrong. Doesn't mean they're lying. There are plenty of perceptions that the Delta Chi's had that were just wrong. Doesn't mean they were lying. There's other things they told you that make it clear they were lying. You know, he talked about how these guys were huge, and you saw put up the heights of the individuals. Look, compared to me, these guys are all the same size, all right? But they're upperclassmen. He's a freshman. He's only been on campus for a few weeks. To him, these guys that have attacked him are huge. Are they, you know, MMA fighters? No. But they are upperclassmen, and there's a lot of them, and they've attacked him. That's what he's perceiving at the time. The other thing is, when we look at these photos, and we've been looking at that Leica scan the whole trial, that was all done in daylight. And it's very important to remember that this scene at the time was a lot darker. Okay. Even Exhibit 353, the video that we just saw that shows was taken at night, it has multiple flashlights all over the place. All those officers are further illuminating that area. So when you look at that exhibit, it's even brighter than it really was at the time. You know, prosecutor described Brough and Peering and the others as sluggish because of how drunk they were. Pointed out that the expert would say, yes, you're stuporous and sluggish when you're that drunk. You all know from your own lives what an aggressive drunk is like, right? It's scary, right? They can move fast when the adrenaline kicks in. Right? Prosecution pointed out that Stephen had his keys the whole time, and that's true. He doesn't deny that. He pointed that out to the police that, yes, he had it. He just, at the time, under the pressure that he was under, couldn't find his keys. They weren't where he normally kept them. It's like a bad movie scene where you can't find your keys to start the car. That's what he was going through at the time. You know, when we see it on the movie, it seems it's just so cliche now. But in real life, it's terrifying. He said, why didn't he just call the police? He told you he only had 1% on his phone. And he knew he only had 1% because he had just previously tried to call Hunter Todd. All of you have phones. I'm sure you're aware that when you have 1%, it might as well be dead. You can't make any phone calls. And he didn't think he had time for that anyway. You know, the state mentioned why if Peering and Brough were both running at Stephen, was Peering shot second? Well, it's because he was further back. He didn't start the same spot as Brough. He was further back when he ran up. Now, you have these jury instructions, and, you know, these jury instructions are supposed to make all of this law more clear to you. Unfortunately, these jury instructions are written by a committee of lawyers, so it doesn't necessarily help things. It's sort of like having engineers write instruction manuals. You know, it'd be a lot better if they had some non-lawyers helping with all these instructions, but unfortunately, this is what we have. I'm not going to go through all of these with you. They are very important. One of them will tell you that you're not supposed to be influenced by sympathy or prejudice. That's on both sides of this. You know, this is a tragic case no matter what. No matter how you feel about this case, whether you're on this side or that side, it's a tragedy for everyone. And you can't let that sympathy cloud your judgment. The other thing to keep in mind is the instruction that says that the state has the burden and they have to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. You've heard that phrase many times before. And the instruction tries to explain that for you. It does a reasonable job of that. But, you know, one thing to think about with evaluating a case, it points out that in a civil case, it's just sort of which way do you lean. You know, you think about those scales of justice. They start off even. You hear all the evidence, and which way do you lean? That's the way you go. Okay? And that's intuitive. That's sort of how we make decisions in everyday life. You know, salad, pizza. You know, leaning towards pizza. That makes sense. That's how you make decisions. It's a little bit different for a criminal case, okay? Because the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which means it's a much higher standard that the state has to show, not just leaning one way. And more so than that, it doesn't start off even. It starts off with the state way down here. Not all the way at the bottom, but pretty close. And they have to present enough evidence to you to prove not just that it's slightly more, but that they have to reverse it. They have to present all that evidence to you. The defense doesn't have to prove anything. Now, the prosecutor went through a lot of the elements with you. He had a nice PowerPoint there that showed you how he's proven his case. And he's talked about intent. There was no intent to kill. Stephen was very clear about that. His intent was to stop. And he didn't know that those gunshots were going to result in death. They could, but he didn't know they would. And they didn't for everyone. I mean, Nick Peering was shot with 2 shots right after Colin Brough, and he didn't die. Just because you get shot with a gun doesn't mean you die. And Stephen wasn't planning on killing anyone. He wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was trying to stop the immediate threat. 2 guys charging at him. And we heard about premeditation. You've heard over and over again how chaotic this scene was, how quickly everything happened. 30 seconds, less than a minute from the time that Stephen was punched on that street until those first shots were fired. Less than a minute. Not enough time to think. You also can't think straight when you've just been clocked or cracked, as Austin said. Glass has been knocked off, your bridge has been knocked out. You have been chased. They may not have chased him all the way to the car, but they were chasing him and his friends, and he knew that. He doesn't have time to think, much less premeditate. Stephen also wasn't being reckless. What he did wasn't a gross deviation from what another would do. He actually showed incredible restraint on the circumstances. Given how scared he was, given the attack, he could have fired a lot more shots, but he didn't do that. He showed a lot of restraint. If anything, he was negligent, failed to recognize the risk, but there was really no time to consciously think about that and disregard that risk. And frankly, under the circumstances, he was reasonable. He wasn't even negligent under the circumstances. He didn't fire a shot unless he was faced with an immediate threat, both when those 2 guys were charging him and when he was being tackled. Those were imminent threats that he was responding to. He didn't just walk up and start shooting. After people stopped charging at him, he didn't keep shooting. He holstered his gun. He put it away. He assessed for the threat, and when there wasn't an imminent threat, he didn't shoot. He was operating under intense fear, a fear that the Delta Chi's instilled in him. And his action was reasonable under the circumstances to defend himself. Put yourself in his shoes. If you're being tackled by a group of guys like this, drunk, outnumber you, they're clearly trying to get your gun. One of them said he thought he had his pinky on it. He was trying to get the gun. And you don't have much more time before they're going to overpower you. What would you do? If you thought, hey, if I pull this out and shoot it up in the air, they'll disperse, that makes sense. That's reasonable under the circumstances. That was really probably his only option. Because if he waited any longer, Zintek would have been on top of him. Others might have been on top of him. There were more guys there. And once they subdue him and take that gun, who knows what happens. And I'm sure none of you would want to bet your life on what would happen next. These also aren't assaults because it's not intentional and he's not being reckless. We just went over that. He's trying to get these Delta Chi's to stop. He's not being reckless in the way that he did that. He's allowed to use deadly force to protect himself when the threat is imminent, and it was, or to protect others. and there were others out there that needed protection, or to stop crime. So if he thinks that they're going to beat up his friends, he's allowed to use that force to try and stop them. It was reasonable under these circumstances. The prosecutor made a point of talking about how Jacob and Shay weren't worried. But we know that's not how Jacob and Shay felt at the time, especially Shay, because he told the police just how terrified he was. He actually used that word, terrified. And I'll get some more of his statements later. But it was clear that he didn't feel that he was not in danger. Stephen was right in assessing that threat. These guys attacked them on the street and chased them. They weren't done with them. Stephen doesn't have a duty to retreat. And you're not deciding whether it was wise to leave his car. We all probably could agree that there were other options, other things he could have done. But your job isn't to second guess what he did. It's to determine whether the choice he made was reasonable. And among the choices he could have made, this one was reasonable. It was reasonable. He has the right to use a defensive display of his weapon. So when he walks up there, he's not breaking the law by brandishing his gun, trying to get these guys to leave. And if they had left, if no one had charged him, none of this would have happened. It's only because in that moment that they charged him that he now has the lethal force he has to use, because he's now facing that imminent threat. If they hadn't charged him and he had shot, it'd be a whole different situation. But that's not what he did. He went up there, he said, back off. We don't know exactly what he said, okay? But he definitely announced, and he told them to back off. He even used the light to try and scare them away. Unfortunately, that didn't work. They still attacked him. And at that moment, as they're barreling down that hill, he had no other choice. He doesn't have a duty to retreat at that point. He can stand his ground in that moment. And trying to retreat in that moment would have been a mistake. They're going downhill. They've got the advantage. There's two of them. If he tries at that point to run, they are going to tackle him. And then they're going to get his gun. He didn't want to take that chance. He had to stop them. He doesn't have a duty to announce that he has a gun either. He did. Many clearly knew that he had a gun, but he doesn't have a duty to announce that. There's nothing in the law that says he has to announce that he has a gun. And this wasn't just verbal provocation. We've heard about that he can't use this force on verbal provocation alone. This wasn't just verbal provocation. If we look at the sort of whole scene, it's clear that there was assaults from the beginning. But even in that moment, it wasn't just verbal provocation. They were charging at him. That's a physical act. If all they did was stand back and say, I'm going to kill you, and then he shot, that would be a problem for Stephen. But that's not what happened. He charged at him. So it's not just verbal provocation. It doesn't, frankly, matter what Colin Brough said. It's the fact that he charged at Stephen in that moment. You also will note in there phrase supervening event. And that's really more appropriate for the second shooting, because that's a supervening event. When he's being tackled, they've got his hand on his gun, they still have their hands on him, and he decides he has to try and pull the gun out and shoot in the air. He doesn't have full bodily control at that moment. So those shots, those errant shots that went off, are not all on him, because he's being tackled at that moment. He doesn't have full bodily control. You know, when you evaluate this evidence, it's easy in this nice, safe courtroom or in your jury deliberation room to use hindsight. Hindsight's sort of 20/20. Of course, Stephen didn't have 20/20 vision at the moment that he's making these decisions. And he wasn't deciding these things in a vacuum, in a nice, safe environment. He was deciding what to do in the dark after he had just been cracked in the head, after he and his friends had been chased, after his friends were still surrounded by these guys, and after they charged at him. That's when he's making that decision. You have to put yourself back in those circumstances and decide if it was reasonable. It's easy to sit here right now and say, he should have just stayed in the car. We know now that he may not have been, he wasn't chased all the way to the car, and it sounds like they might have lost sight of him. He might have been able to just stay in his car, and they wouldn't have known he was there. Of course, they still would have beat up his friends, but he might have gotten away. But he didn't know that at the time, and it's reasonable under the circumstances for him not to realize that.
Mr. McCown, we're going to get close to the lunchtime. Can we go and take a recess?
Yeah, this is not a bad place to break.
All right. Let's go ahead and stand at recess, folks. Again, please remember the admonition. We'll get back together at 1:30.